In the very first episode of this podcast, I mentioned just how big the Roman Empire was. By the time of Trajan, that's the very beginning of the 2nd century AD, just one man ruled over 60 million people spread throughout the Mediterranean basin, from damp and dreary Great Britain to the hot, dry, and desolate wilderness of Syria. And as I hinted last time, Trajan would push the boundaries of this massive empire ever further east. But one thing we haven't yet addressed is how the emperor actually managed such a vast imperial apparatus. Well, by an accident of history, we have an incredible trove of letters between the emperor Trajan and one of his governors. The letters offer unparalleled access into the workings of the Roman Empire, revealing Trajan's ruthless expectations of those under him, his miserly attitude, and even his paranoia. And so let's dig into the letters of Trajan and Pliny on this episode of the Pax Romana podcast. Episode 32, Pliny and Trajan, or How to Run the Roman Empire. Before we begin, if you haven't already, please check out my book, Pax Romana, The Plague That Shook the Roman World. It's out with Princeton University Press, and you can order it just about anywhere books are sold. Check it out, and if you liked the book, please leave a review on Amazon or Goodreads or wherever it is that you review books. Thank you so much for your support. Let's get to the episode. Under Trajan's reign, which lasted from AD 90 to 117, we gain unique insight into how the Roman Empire was run. A trove of letters between the Emperor Trajan and one of his governors act as a kind of case study of Roman administration of its provinces. You know about Trajan from the last couple of episodes, but you probably don't know about the governor on the other end of those letters. His name was Pliny the Younger. Pliny was an orator and an author, a member of Rome's equestrian class by birth. This was a noble class of people just below the rank of senator. The main difference between equestrians and senators was that they hadn't run for office. Pliny was, of course, well educated, and he had survived the reigns of several emperors, including Domitian. And you can learn more about that hated emperor on episode 27 of this podcast. Pliny had a great career. He was promoted regularly. He was heavily involved in the Roman court system, especially the civil court, no doubt earning accolades for his orations. In fact, it was his panegyric of the Emperor Trajan that we talked about in episode 29. So we have 73 letters in total from Pliny to Trajan, and we have 51 letters from Trajan back to Pliny. I don't want to go through all of them, but I want to talk about a few of the most interesting ones. Pliny was governor of the province of Bithynia, starting in about 110 AD, and then for at least a couple of years into 112 AD. Bithynia is in the northwest of Asia Minor, now modern Turkey, and its capital city was Nicomedia. This province used to be governed by the Senate. That is, when Rome's first emperor Augustus took over the empire, he split the provinces in half. He took the provinces that were most likely to need soldiers and where further conquest was a necessity for pacifying the provinces, and he left the Senate most of the interior provinces that likely didn't need many soldiers at all. And Bithynia was one of these senatorial provinces. But under Trajan, that province had been having some trouble. And so the emperor decided to take it over himself and send his trusted friend and the man that flattered him so heavily with the panegyric in the Senate, Pliny the Younger, over to deal with the problems. And so in the letters between these two men, we learn what the duties of a Roman governor were, how administrators got things done in the Roman Empire. The letters show us how involved emperors could be, certainly how involved Trajan was, and they give us a sense of some of the unique problems that would crop up in Roman cities. In some cases, these are very different than the problems that modern cities might face, but surprisingly, there are some similarities, as we'll see. In fact, one of the earlier letters speaks to something that we see all the time, even in modern governments: financial boondoggles and corruption. So Pliny writes Trajan to say that there was uncollected money that was owed to the city from a variety of rich people who neglected to pay the money on various pretenses and excuses. Pliny writes the Emperor Trajan to say that the public funds are, quote, unwarrantably applied. So there are uncollected debts and deadbeat borrowers in the city of Nicomedia. It even sounds like from the letter that debts were paid out for illegal purposes as well. And so Pliny asks the emperor for some help because the books are so badly cooked. He says this, quote, would it not be proper to send a surveyor here? Much might be deducted from what is charged by those who have the conduct of the public works, if a faithful accounting were to be taken. That's Pliny's 16th letter to Trajan. And to this letter, we actually have Trajan's reply. Trajan insists that the problem needs to be dealt with as soon as possible. The people that spent this money and borrowed, seemingly without any intention to pay back, need to be prosecuted. But Trajan is not going to help Pliny out. Quote, I have scarcely surveyors sufficient to inspect those works which I'm carrying on in Rome. But persons of integrity and skill in this art may be found most certainly in every province, so that they will not fail you if only you will make due inquiry. And that's Trajan's letter back to Pliny, letter number 17. Trajan's almost being passive-aggressive here, letting Pliny know, rather than bother him to get a surveyor sent out from Rome, Pliny should just do the job himself and find somebody locally to help out. This letter proves something about ancient Rome that many historians have suspected. Number one, that cities in the Roman Empire were often very poorly managed. The Roman state, despite its propaganda, was not a model of efficiency. There were large amounts of waste and grift and corruption, and the governor was expected to figure things out himself. He had a mandate from the central government to ensure that revenues continued to flow in, but the central government was not going to provide much help. Instead, Pliny here is expected to find some local elites to help him solve his problems. Trajan's not going to lift a finger. Sticking with issues of finance, we have another letter that also speaks to something that we continue to deal with today that many of us don't want to: taxes. In letter number 34, Pliny writes Trajan and tells him that one of the city's oldest bathhouses has fallen into disrepair. He actually calls it ruinous. Pliny uses this letter for a humble brag. He tells Trajan that he should be able to pay for the bath with the funds that he's collected from all those deadbeat debtors. Pliny doesn't really need to ask Trajan for permission to repair the bath, but it gives him an opportunity to tell the emperor that he's made good on his mandate to get hold of that money that was owed the city. Trajan's reply, however, is interesting. He says this, quote, if erecting a public bath will not be too great a charge upon the people, we certainly can do it, provided, however, that no new tax is levied for such a purpose, nor indeed should any taxes be diverted from necessary services. And that's letter number 35. So Trajan tells Pliny, great, I'm glad you're doing a good job. And sure, of course they can have a bath. Just make sure you don't raise their taxes. Now, why does Trajan not want Pliny to raise new taxes? Taxes were a sensitive issue in the Roman world, and although their tax rates were very, very low compared to today, maybe 10 to 15% of their resources overall were taken, but the reality of subsistence living in the ancient world is such that even slightly more taxes than that would have pushed people over the edge. They wouldn't have been able to provide for their own sustenance. And so despite what sounds to us a pretty great tax rate of just 10 to 15%, that was really about as much as many ancient peoples could afford. And Trajan does not want Pliny adding any more taxes on the backs of those who live in Bithynia. We also see in this letter a need for Pliny to prove to the emperor that he is indeed doing a good job. Bithynia had been taken over by Trajan because it had fallen into a state of mismanagement. And it's really important for Pliny to let the emperor know that everything's going all right. One of the issues that we haven't talked much about on this podcast is slavery, and I certainly hope to rectify that with an episode focused just on Roman slavery later. But this issue does come up in Pliny and Trajan's letters in quite an interesting way. I'd like to read an excerpt from letter number 40. It's fascinating. Quote, this is Pliny. Quote, I find there are in several cities people who've taken on themselves to act as public slaves. Notwithstanding, they have been condemned either to the mines or to the public games or other such severe punishments. On the one hand, to send them back again to those punishments would, I think, be acting too severely against them. On the other hand, if we retain convicted criminals in the public service, this does not seem a decent thing. And that's letter number 40. Pliny is saying that there are some slaves that are giving a stipend to do work in the city, but that really they're convicted criminals and they were slated to be punished by working the mines or being forced into the arena, degrading and likely deadly punishments. So Pliny's asking Trajan, hey, what do I need to do about these people? On the one hand, it seems cruel to take them away from what they're doing and send them into these awful punishments. On the other hand, we want to make sure that justice is enforced. We can't just have criminals being allowed to escape their sentences. This actually is a complicated issue, and Trajan's answer is quite judicious. Here is what the emperor says. Quote, Pliny, you'll remember that you were sent to Bithynia for this exact purpose, correcting abuses which appear in need of reform. People that have been convicted within the last 10 years must be sent back to their original punishment. But if they've served more than 10 years, let them attend the public baths, cleanse the sewers, and repair the streets and highways. That's letter number 41. So Trajan first reminds Pliny, hey, this is your job, buddy. You need to figure this out. But then he gives some helpful advice to his governor and friend Pliny. Justice needs to be done in the case of those that are within 10 years of their sentencing, but the others should be given crap jobs. And I mean literally crap jobs. Cleaning out the baths, which would have been full of all sorts of refuse, cleaning out the sewers, and cleaning the muck out of the streets. These are some of the worst jobs that you could possibly do in any ancient city. They're degrading, they're dirty, they're disgusting, they're likely to lead to disease and death. So Trajan in many ways is not giving these men an easy way out of their sentence, but he has some mercy. All right, I just want to read one more letter, and this is probably my favorite among those between Pliny and Trajan because it's so revealing of Trajan's inner thoughts. Pliny mentions a disaster that occurred in Nicomedia while he was there. A good portion of the city ended up catching on fire. The wind blew and the flames destroyed many buildings in the city. It was a disaster. Pliny says in his letter that in addition to the fire being so severe, people just basically sat around and watched it burn. The city doesn't have anything with which to fight fire, not even buckets. Pliny writes Trajan to say that he's begun the work of collecting firefighting equipment. These would be buckets and small wagons that could carry water to the fire. But then Pliny asks Trajan in letter 42 if Trajan is willing to allow the Nicomedians to organize a group of firefighters, 150 men who on a volunteer basis could be called upon and trained to fight fires if one should break out in the city again. Now, this seems to us very prudent. Why wouldn't a city of over 100,000 people have at least a few hundred firefighters? Makes sense, especially when the city has already caught fire and is likely to do so again. Trajan's reply, however, is fascinating, and this is letter 43. Quote, societies of this sort have greatly disturbed the peace of the province in general, and of those cities in particular. Whatever name we give them, and for whatever purposes they might be founded, such societies will not fail to form themselves into factitious assemblies, however short their meetings may be. This is an incredible comment from Trajan. Because there have been some recent uprisings and unrest in the province, Trajan is paranoid that even a group of 150 firefighters might cause a problem in the city of Nicomedia. So the emperor allows Pliny to have some supplies and equipment, but not to organize firefighters. That's how scared Trajan is of rebellion in one of his previously most placid and safe provinces. And Trajan is not known for being an overly paranoid emperor, somebody like Domitian or Caligula. This letter gives a sense that order in the Roman provinces was a very delicate thing. And despite imperial propaganda on the coins and statues and monuments that suggest that everybody submitted and bowed down to the rule of Roman emperors, certainly based on Trajan's behavior here, who was one of the most secure emperors in Roman history, it seems as though there was some cause for alarm. In the letters between Pliny and Trajan, we see an empire of over 60 million people being run almost like a kind of household. There's not an advanced bureaucracy with thousands of nameless officials, but the emperor is a kind of father and personal patron of everybody in his empire. And he uses his governors as extensions of this kind of family of the state in order to provide services and ensure discipline in these populations. We also learn from these letters a lot about Roman governors. Pliny was just one man. He likely went to Bithynia with a very small group of family members, friends, slaves, and freedmen. There's little evidence in these letters and in other sources that a governor and his staff were specially trained in ruling any given province. They essentially just arrived in town one day and began to figure things out. And when they left, the next guy came in, started afresh, and had to do the same thing. In other words, the actual running of the Roman Empire was surprisingly amateurish. But people like Pliny were still very talented, and they relied on that talent and their own personal charisma to get things done. These were people, after all, that had honed their skills in the courts in Rome or in the political arena of the Roman Senate in some cases. They had the ability to network and to negotiate, which they used to collaborate with local elites to get things done, to build a clientele, to accomplish their mandate, to keep order in the province and ensure that revenue continued to flow back into Rome. Otherwise, governors like Pliny tried to do as little as possible. In the Roman Empire, local officials continued to be elected by local assemblies. Local cultures and customs were largely respected and left to themselves. Now, there's one more letter between Pliny and Trajan that we did not look at. It is one of the most important sources in all of ancient history. In this letter, Pliny captures and puts on trial Christians. And it's one of the earliest sources from outside the Bible which shows Christian persecution in the Roman Empire. It's a fascinating and very detailed source that gives us unique insight into the history of the Christian church in its first century of existence. Why did Pliny arrest Christians? What did he do with them? And what were Trajan's opinions on this growing new religion in the Roman Empire? We'll talk about that letter next time on the Pax Romana podcast.
Thanks for listening to the Pax Romana podcast. For more information, including a list of primary sources and further reading, check the show notes. Music by Red Productions and Exelcore. Follow Dr. Colin Elliott on X at ProfCPE or email colin@paxromanapodcast.com. Listen to more episodes on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or just about anywhere podcasts are available. Stay tuned for the next episode of the Pax Romana podcast.